Thank you all for coming here. I know that there's a lot of other fantastic talks that are going on during this time slot, but the Cantina was something that was very near and dear to our developers and all of the departments on our team, and we wanted to bring some of the insights and some of the learnings from that journey to you all, and hopefully you can bring some of your insights as to how you execute some of your robust narrative hub spaces back to us. A couple of reminders before we dig in. If you could please silence your noisemakers, so your phones and air horns and kazoos. Just hold that off until, I guess, our QA session that's going to be extended across the hall. And there's also going to be a survey that is sent out after this via email. All right. So before we dig into today's talk, we just wanted to give you a brief introduction to both of us so you understand our background, our experience, and the perspectives and different angles that we hit this pretty complex problem at. So I'm Cheyenne Poulani-Morin. I'm a senior game writer on the Jedi team. I've been in the game industry for about 9 years. I started off in the mobile and indie space before I moved into AAA, where I focused mostly on dynamic and state-based and nonlinear narrative structure and storytelling. That primed me pretty well to move on to the Jedi Fallen Order team, where I implemented our narrative hub spaces, which were much smaller in scale, mostly Mantis Landing hub pads, and all of that pipeline and tech and approaches fed into what eventually was going to become our next evolution of our narrative hub spaces, which is the Cantina. And I'll hand it off to Cole now.
Awesome. Thank you, Cheyenne. Hi, I'm Cole Swaney. I'm a senior narrative designer at BitReactor right now, but I worked with Cheyenne on Survivor. I did a bit of sliding around between narrative design and writing, but a lot of it was very hub-focused and making sure that the design and tech side of things was very hand-in-glove with the writing end of things. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing more on the design, implementation, pipeline side of the Cantina. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to be covering how we approached and tackled and executed all of this content for our state-based narrative hub space, Pyloon Saloon, which is our version of the Cantina. Brief roadmap before we dig in. We're going to do an overview as to how we initially approached this larger fantasy of how do we deliver on a Star Wars Cantina. Cole is then going to take us through how we mapped out and created some event targets to give us some guardrails and some goals for our writing room and for the rest of the team to rally around. We're going to take a detour into the writing room process and talk about the types of topics and the ways in which we tried to get some specificity as well as match the broader tone of the game. We're going to revisit our pipeline for a bit and talk about how we modified sort of in flight based on how development was unfolding. Then we're going to touch on DEI. Inclusive storytelling was always a fundamental goal and tenet that we used to realize a really robust and wild and engaging cast for the Cantina. But there were a lot of hurdles that came along with that ambitious goal, so we wanted to take a brief detour and mention and call out some of those so that if you want to infuse your own spaces with inclusive storytelling, you'll have a little bit of a map to understand some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges. And then Cole is going to take us away with a final wrap-up where we talk about what we actually delivered and some of the ways in which maybe we would have done it differently and some of the targets that we maybe overwrote for, underwrote for, and how we might do it differently the second time. All right, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Jedi franchise, we wanted to show a little bit of a primer in terms of the main gameplay experience and what the player really experiences most of the time. So, in the Jedi franchise, it's a third-person action-adventure game. It's heavily inspired by Soulsborne combat, as well as Metroidvania-inspired traversal and exploration. So the player's on the sticks quite a bit. They have a lot of agency to explore these worlds. And the narrative team had the challenge of also trying to balance out the darker tones of this specific chapter in galactic history. It is one of the darkest periods in the Star Wars universe. You play as Cal Kestis, one of the last surviving Jedi, and the Empire is quickly closing in, and he's trying to find home. So Star Wars itself as an IP has a lightheartedness that we also wanted to capture, but didn't fight against that broader sort of story goal of really bringing the player to these darker spaces. All right, I think we got a good idea of what you can expect in the game. So that brings us to the larger Cantina fantasy. When you think about Star Wars as just a broader universe, what are some of the things that come up in your mind? Okay, anyway. Well, for us, the Cantina was a big one. The Cantina that's featured in Episode 4 has just left such a sort of cultural imprint in our imagination. And when we were thinking about how to evolve our narrative spaces, we felt that delivering on this fantasy would be a huge step in the right direction. This led us to breaking down that fantasy into 2 different buckets, and that was our narrative pillars and our design pillars. So starting with our narrative pillars, we pulled some of the exact language that we used in our original Cantina design doc that dated back to April of 2020. We wanted to share this language because this is how we rallied a lot of resources and a lot of developers to become excited and willing to put in their energy, love, resources into making this goal a reality and delivering it to our players to the best of our ability. So number 1, we wanted this space to house evolving tales. We wanted there to be meaningful narrative progression in individual character arcs, and we also wanted to reward the player for repeated engagement. Number 2, we wanted a diverse cast. The original Cantina was filled with all sorts of aliens and humanoids and rogues and bounty hunters and everyone under the galactic sun, and we felt that if we used inclusive storytelling and tried to align this with some of our DEI goals, that we would realize that to its fullest. And finally, because the events of the main campaign bring the player to some pretty dark places. There's a lot of twists and turns and tragic losses, and we even have a more tragic 5-act structure. We wanted to make sure that this was a narrative space that would be a welcome respite for Cal during his dark journey as a kind of light in the dark. That brings us to our design pillars. So just to mention, the narrative did not come necessarily before the design pillars. They evolved very much in tandem, hand in hand. But this is what it led to. Number 1, we wanted to reflect the world state. So as the events unfolded in the main campaign, we wanted to make sure that this space was also evolving in step with it. So every time the player comes back, we wanted to have updated, fresh content that felt like it was evolving along with Cal's journey. Number 2, we wanted this to be the primary hub space for various side content systems to be housed. So the main planet that you're traversing in Jedi Survivor is Kobo. It was one of our first semi-open world planets. It is a sprawl of hidden and side and optional content. And so we wanted to feed the player back into one space so they didn't feel like they're getting whiplash just trying to check in on systems on different planets. Number 3, we wanted this space to grow over time, and we wanted the player to be actively driving that. And number 4, we wanted to design the space so that the player was being routed through it as often as possible. There was a lot of resources that went into all of these hub states, and so we wanted to make sure that the player was visiting it and actually getting exposed to some of that content. So that's very ambitious high goals and all well and good, but what did we actually ship with? So Pyloon Saloon, which is our cantina, did indeed become the primary narrative hub for Jedi Survivor. It housed 18 distinct NPCs with their own conversations and storylines, and this is outside of our core Mantis cast. They possess over 5,000 lines of fully recorded VO dialogue. In addition, we also have 17 main, very distinct world states and countless permutations layered on top of that to account for optional player engagement. This also became the unified space for multiple narrative and side gameplay systems to intersect, and that included our bounty hunter system, fishing, gardening, hollow bedding, rumors, and to some degree even our legendary beast system. So to demonstrate the evolution of this narrative hub space through the course of the game, we have these two GIFs. One on the left is a very early visit into the cantina. It's kind of a dilapidated dive at this point. There's not too much narrative content that is available because the player hasn't tapped into any of these NPC relationships. They haven't invested too much into either of the side content systems either. So we don't really see the aquarium in a really good state, and it's kind of more sparse in the types of interactions that are offered to the player. On the right, this is our cantina in a mid-game full swing state. So a lot of these NPC relationships have been tapped. You know a little bit about their background. You may have invested in a lot of these side content systems. An entire second floor of the cantina has opened. You've recruited some optional NPCs out in the world. And so we have the music system online. And the aquarium is looking like a real aquarium now. So now that we've talked about how we initially approached this and kind of broadly conceptualized the cantina, I'm going to hand it off to Cole to talk about how we mapped out and tried to plan this massive sprawl of content.
Thank you, Cheyenne. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we set targets for all of the dialogue that we need. And a lot of this came down to questions like, how much writing do we need? What sort of writing do we need? How do we apportion that content, and how do we present it to the player? And then how do we prioritize this massive bucket of content that we have? We had a lot of different kinds of dialogue events, from walking up to characters and initiating straightforward conversations to eavesdropping and hearing ambient dialogues playing out in the background as you walk past. And we wanted all of these to reflect the progression of the player, the progression of the main story, and also to reward repeated engagement with all of the side content here. So just to sort of conceptualize for a moment what this problem looks like when we're looking at it, this sort of represents the rise and fall arc of the cantina, which is mapped onto the 5-act structure that Cheyenne alluded to for the main story of the game. So you have this sort of initial rise in the first 3 acts, culminating in sort of a false victory and climax in the middle, and then you have these darker states at the end of the cantina. And what this meant for us was that in the early states, the cantina was filling up. There was this sort of groundswell and the feeling of community as the player had more opportunity to rope in other NPCs to the space. There was this sort of Mardi Gras moment where we think we've Ding Dong the Witch is dead, the whole thing, and then at the end it falls off, the jackboot of the Empire descends, and the cantina starts to thin out, and we're left in this sort of somber, reflective, I guess have the good times have died type of space. So when we're thinking about how is the player going to experience this content, one thing we could count on is that right at the beginning of the game, when they were first introduced to the cantina, we knew they had to visit the cantina twice, and this was our opportunity to jam as much onboarding as possible into those visits. So we were sort of surfacing side content to the player, showing that narrative would be evolving alongside the main story, and we got to intro some of our key side characters. But from here, there's quite a lot of variance in the narrative experience. So maybe our ideal player might have sort of sampled the cantina a few times throughout the game. They would have gotten some interesting pulse checks, and they could sort of chart this rise and fall of the cantina arc over the course of the game. They might see it at one of the heightened states, and then they might kind of see it during one of the emptying out states at the end, and it would sort of resonate with what's happening in the main plot. That was the goal. But just as valid and certainly just as possible, the player could visit as soon as they had to, and then as soon as they were free, never see it again. And if they did, maybe they'd come back after they'd finished the main story, which is certainly a big departure in terms of the experience of that player. And again, just as validly, we could have this piece of work right here who insists on visiting the cantina constantly throughout the game. And we want to make sure as well that this person isn't turned off and hearing a lot of repeated lines and whatnot, but is rewarded for sort of taking this path throughout. So again, there's quite a lot of divergence in the player experiences that we're designing for here. If you'll permit me to take a slight philosophical detour on this, a lot of the problems that come here are sort of the ways that we interpret the way that we should be writing these stories in very interactive spaces. So sort of the kind of father of what we understand as narrative theory and narratology was the old huckster called Aristotle, who essentially said, anything that anything that you could take out of a story and the story is still there and still works doesn't belong in the story, because a story is a unity and a story should be one thing, and anything that it's not shouldn't be in the story. That really doesn't hold in the interactive space because we don't really have the luxury of saying the player has to experience these things. There are a lot of bits of narrative content that can be taken or left at will. So we have sort of this filler content or optional content that we need to conceptualize, and that means kind of changing the way that we're thinking about writing this content. Well, along comes Roland Barthes and says, hang on, I'm not so sure about this. Actually, there are kind of a lot of ways to interpret a story. Sure, we're stacking all the words in order, but there are a lot of entrances and exits to the way that everyone encounters the story. So really, there's not one way that everyone is experiencing a story, but there are a lot of ways that the story is permuting throughout. And this sort of, this explodes into a bunch of possibilities with more modern narratologists who are focusing on digital media, like Janet Murray and Espen Arseth, who are saying, actually, we can have structures like the rhizomatic structure, this root system of narrative content where you can loop back on yourself and go off in a direction, hit a dead end, come back. And again, forgive me for jumping into all of this, but this is all sort of to say that we're in a sort of sloshy space when we have a very linear story happening on the main path, Cal's sort of main arc, and then we have a very nonlinear set of stories that are sort of supposed to be a reflection of that. So in a way, we have to sort of balance between those two and try to provision for both ends of the spectrum here. So to jump back towards the concrete end of things, let's take an example. These are Dana and Grok, two of the characters in the cantina who you can meet early on. There are a couple of prospectors and treasure hunters who've come to Kobo, the planet on which the cantina is based, in search of treasure. And these are truly a couple of overripe old curmudgeons. They're very unpleasant to be around. And the player can first encounter them planning a job in Dredger Gorge. Near the middle of the game, you can encounter them again. That job has gone horribly awry. Grok is supremely peeved because Dana has nearly dropped a steel beam on his head, but Dana is insisting, no, that was just a fluke. We can do this. And you're allowed to interact with them at any of these moments. And then at the end, unfortunately, again, as the Empire is on the rise, Grok ultimately perishes and pays the ultimate price for both of them when one of the jobs go awry and an Imperial patrol takes him out. And Dana is left in this sort of reflective space where she's stewing a bit in it, and it's not really clear whether she's learned the lesson or not. So again, with our little lines, we can see it would be really nice if the player experienced this in sequence and they would get a sense of the entire story. But it's entirely possible that they will skip the beginning, jump in at the middle, hit the end, and of course, possible as well that they could just hear the end of the conversation here, which the end of this arc would mean they never meet Grok, they don't really understand what's going on, and Dana's sad for no reason. So some of the ways that we try to provision for these alternate paths would be, we wrote different on-ramp interactions depending on when in the story you first met Dana and Grok. So if you met them at the beginning, you get sort of the standard introduction to them as a duo, and then you can follow their arc throughout. But if you meet them for the first time in the middle, we write a different dialogue where they get introduced, which onboards the players to all the facts that have happened in their arc beforehand, and then we can proceed with what's going to happen there. We can also leverage elements outside of just dialogue in the narrative space. Kind of morbidly, you can actually find Grok's body out in the world after this job has gone wrong. You can use Cal's psychometry to sort of get a vision of Dana mourning his death, and that adds depth to the story in a very nonlinear way. You don't have to have experienced any of that in sequence. So these are some of the ways that we were starting to conceptualize telling sort of linear plot arcs through a lot of the nonlinear systems. And again, all of this is kind of part and parcel in what it means to tell interactive stories. So yeah, these were some of the questions we had. So back to our standard question, how much writing do we need per state, per character, per dialogue type? We found that a lot of these could be sort of divided along two poles. On the one end, we had heavily state-based dialogue. This dialogue was authored, it was sort of deterministic, it was going to be the same every time, and it focused on Cal's story. So in the later parts of the game, Cal experiences a great personal tragedy. When you go back to the cantina, you want to see that reflected in the interactions Cal has in the space. You don't want him to go and crack a joke and leave Turgle rolling on the floor. That would be a great discontinuity in the narrative. So we're trying to avoid those kinds of moments. On the other end of things, though, we have more engagement-based dialogue, and this dialogue is evergreen. We're not throwing it away once it's no longer relevant. And it's more focused on the NPC stories, getting to learn more about Moran the smuggler, or getting to listen in on someone else's dialogue and learn a bit more about their life. And these sort of play to some of the different fantasies that Cheyenne took us through very early on. So on the one end of things, we have our light and the dark story. We get to see Cal's story reflected through this space. On the other end of things, though, we have that fantasy of just being a fly on the wall in the Mos Eisley Cantina and seeing a bunch of wacky aliens doing their thing and getting to walk up to them and learn more about them. As far as how we prioritized this content when presenting it to the player, the ultimate approach we used was we prioritized state-specific content. So if you've just gone out, finished a level out in the world and ignited a giant space laser that's now shooting across the sky, it feels nice to go back to the cantina, to walk up to someone, and they ask you, what the heck is that big laser that's now shooting across the sky? So we wanted that level of reflectivity. But to reward repeated engagement, the evergreen content was lower priority, but if you came back and you continued to listen, you would get through this content as well. And this proved to be sort of the main paradigm that we used, with a few exceptions, to sort of stratify the different types of content that we were presenting to the player. Cheyenne's going to talk a bit more about how we broke down the game writing needs into these states and how we approached the writing itself. But broadly, we broke the game down into 5 macro states, which roughly mapped onto the 5 acts of the main story. And then we broke all of those down into substates. And these were individual player visits where NPCs were standing in deterministic locations, or some of them were standing in random locations. So this is again, the main paradigm we used when thinking about this content. So going back to the GIFs we presented earlier, the one on the left is macro state 1. The cantina is dilapidated and ramshackle, and it doesn't look like much. And then in macro state 3, the cantina in full swing. We spawn a lot more random NPCs. We have a lot more ambient dialogue that we've written to keep it firing. And this all is in furtherance of selling that main arc of the cantina across the game. When we were looking at individual substates, some of the questions we were answering were, where is it most interesting for characters to stand in a given substate? If they'd just been in a cutscene where they were interacting with each other, it'd be great to position them next to each other in the cantina so that if the player is interested, they can follow up on that relationship. So for every substate in the game, we placed characters very specifically on the floor of the cantina, and this gave us very accurate dialogue targets because we knew if we're going to have these people standing next to each other, we might as well have them interact, and we might as well write some ambient dialogue for them to share. One of the other main elements, and probably the final thing I'm going to hit on the dialogue end of things, would be how we conceptualized these character arcs. It was ultimately pretty tricky to string a lot of these character arcs in a very linear sequence when the player can be encountering the cantina in a very non-linear way. So one of the ways that we simplified the work on our end was we reduced these into what we called inflection buckets. So probably best illustrated by example. So Moran, again, is this very frosty smuggler who you meet early on. And when you first meet him, he's very critical. He doesn't really want anything to do with you. But as you chisel through that lovable piece of granite, you eventually get him to warm up to you, and this sort of unlikely friendship forms. So instead of having a completely linear set of conversations that take Moran from beginning to end there, we had one bucket of conversations where Moran doesn't like you. We had a second bucket where Moran does like you, and they were connected by an inflection event, one sort of high-value conversation where there's a very perceptible turn, and the state of affairs between these two characters change. So we were able to write a lot of different content without tracking a whole lot of the narrative overhead that would come with very specifically trying to plot these out in a nonlinear way. So, for instance, we could also then include state-specific dialogue in these two buckets. So Moran can now not like you, and there could be a giant laser in the sky, and we can write a conversation for that that doesn't have to adhere to a strict narrative sequence. We use this inflection arc planning for a lot of the side characters in the Cantina. For instance, Mosey was the owner of the Legendary Beasts system. So instead of rewarding repeated engagement with Mosey, we were rewarding increased engagement with the system. The more legendary beasts you hunted, the further you got in Mosey's inflection arc. And similarly, with Cage, our hard-boiled bounty hunter, the more bounties you hunted, the more you learned about Cage as you went back and interacted with her. So I'm going to hand the mic back to Cheyenne now, proverbially, and then we're going to look at more about the writing process specifically and how we approached all of these buckets of content, which we've now sort of loosely outlined, and how we started to fill them in.
Thank you, Cole. So a brief overview of what our writing room looks like on the Jedi team. For Survivor, we had anywhere between 3 to 6 writers who were expected to write in any given character voice for the Cantina for any given world state. This evolved into more of a TV writing room style of review and table reads. And this gave us the following routine. First, we would brainstorm in the room, and we would break the larger macro state, and then move into more specific, more granular topics with character breaking. So how are those characters actually responding to these world events? We would then assign out some conversations to each of the writers, take a few days to draft them, and then we'd throw them back at the writing room for a table read. We were all expected to try on every voice, even the ones that we were not so comfortable with, had to experiment with a lot of accents to really make it believable and punchy. And then we would get some either live edits or we would get some feedback from our writers. Sometimes we would change the topic entirely. And we would keep going with this process, rinse and repeat until the conversation was to a ship quality. All right, we're going to walk you through a mini exercise in terms of how we populated these buckets and the types of conversation topics that usually fell into these. So the first step was situating the room with macro state brainstorming. So we're looking at the broader world events like a laser going off in the sky, or maybe you just took down the leader of the Bedlam Raiders. This also roughly mapped on to our 5 acts. So if Cal is feeling hopeful, that's going to be kind of the tonal backdrop. Or if Cal just experienced tragedy, then that's also going to dictate some of these conversation topics. This is more of our evergreen topic, bucket of topics, because they are substate agnostic. They can play throughout a range of different substates. So some of the usual topics that we would draw on would be individual NPC backstories. So this would be along the lines of, when did Grease and Monk link up? What's the story behind them naming it Pyloon Saloon? When did the town matriarch, Doma, get into Kobo, and any backstories that she might have of events that have occurred over the last 50 years since she's been on planet. We also fit in some relevant slice of life topics. So this is like a day in the life, a day in the ordinary life of one of our wacky characters. Like, what was Turgle up to today? How has his priorities changed based on some world events? That was a nice kind of filler flavor kind of topic. And then we also used this bucket for calling out environmental or feature improvements. So there's a huge difference between macro state 1 and 2. The second floor of the cantina has opened up. And for some of the resident patrons who've been here for a while, that's a huge seismic change. And so they're going to call that out for the player. And it's also used to point the player up to these newly accessible features. So once we had that broader tone, we would add some reactivity and specificity by breaking down the substates and doing less of this evergreen content and more of this state-based content. This led to the following topics, things like NPC reactions to critical path updates. If you just took down Ravis, a character like Turgle, who has been enmeshed and entangled with that faction for a while, is going to have a very personal reaction to that update. This also doubled as a way to remind the player of their current objectives and some newly opened content. Whenever a new Cantina NPC would move into the space, or a NPC relationship hit an inflection, we also use this bucket to call that out and prioritize those changes in relationships. Cage is a really good example of someone that we use as sort of a spokesperson for calling out new NPCs in the space. As a bounty hunter who has her eye on the door constantly, she's checking out whoever's moving into the space and determining whether or not they are someone she can manipulate, if they're a threat, if they could be a potential ally, what have you. And finally, we also use this bucket to update the player on any side systems that have evolved and to remind them of any rumors that will direct them back out into the world. A good example of this is Scuba Steve will have a high priority conversation if you just collected enough fish and you've updated the aquarium. So this brings us to one of my favorite parts of the talk. We wanted to demo what our table read process is like and how some of these characters evolved from an earlier state and an earlier understanding that the room had of these characters, and how further in the game they have a little more depth and nuance and maybe a little more personal stake in the events of the game. So we're going to do a live table read. I will be playing Moran, and Cole will be playing Turgle.
Very apologetically. Hey, Moran.
Oh, please, no.
You wouldn't turn down the opportunity of a lifetime, would you?
Stop it.
Because I have a business proposition that will make your eye stems spin.
Let me make this eminently clear. I have, in my time, struck deals with every flavor of unsavory scamp you can imagine.
Uh-huh.
I have funded ventures so risky they would make a hut skip breakfast.
Uh-huh.
But I would sooner feed my credits to a monkey lizard than go into business with the likes of you.
With a small one-time investment.
No.
Eh.
So that's one of our early, almost like caricatures of each of these characters. Very quintessential Turgle, quintessential Moran. This could probably play during a range of early substates and macro states. And now we're going to move on to a conversation that takes place more in the middle of the game. And Cole will be reprising Turgle, and I will be playing Cal.
Cal, is it true? Is Ravis really gone?
Yeah. You relieved?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But I'm actually sad. It almost feels like I killed him.
He did try to kill you.
Oh, yeah, a few times. But none of this would have happened if I wasn't trying to make a quick credit. I'm a murderer. Hey, Monk, what's it take for an amphipod with blood on his hands to get some service around here?
So these two conversations, again, they demo a simpler caricature version of Turgle, and then later in the game, once you've had enough time and you've been exposed to the dynamics of the Cantina and how some of these NPCs relate to the broader game world, we turn Turgle, who was initially just an agent of chaos up to irrelevant antics, into someone who has a stake into what Cal's doing and how he's affecting the world. So I'm going to wrap up this segment with a little bit of writing room etiquette that we landed on. First of all, the writing room requires a lot of mutual trust and willingness. We do these table reads, and we have a lot of fun and silliness with it, but we also need to accept that your fellow writers start off with an initial intent, and if it's not landing for you, you've got to build off of it, and you need to use the classic improv rule of, yes, I accept the premise, and let's build on it. This kind of leads into the second rule, which is you can't be precious with initial drafts, because we had a really quick turnaround, and we would often throw our first drafts and some really wild swings at the room. And sometimes it was a really good initial idea, but it wasn't quite landing in the way that we wanted the player to experience this character. So that's more of like a yes, but. So accept the initial premise, but be willing to pivot and shift directions based on writing room feedback so that we deliver the best representation of this character. And lastly, you gotta have fun and be silly. And another reason why we did those table reads, we did those weekly, sometimes twice a week. And that was maybe the highlights of that project, at least in my experience. I'm going to hand it back to Cole to talk about how our pipeline kind of changed along the way.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm going to take us a bit more into some of the specifics of the ways that our narrative decisions were informed by our pipeline. And I think that ultimately this was not sort of a one-directional process where the narrative was conceived, written, and implemented, and then it was done. It was being implemented as we were writing it. So we got a lot of feedback over the course of the writing process that allowed us to sort of steer the ship very slowly and lay track in front of the train, and we could make some corrections as we were going. And so ultimately the pipeline played a lot into the decisions we were making as a narrative team. So at a very high level, the four main tools that went into the writing process were Miro, the virtual whiteboard tool that you saw earlier, Writer Duet, our screenwriting software. We used a dialogue matrix in Google Sheets, and then we had our content management system, a tool called Heckle, which certainly deserves its own talk, but for right now, essentially takes all of the dialogue lines, hooks them up to Wise events, we tag them up, and it sends it into the engine. So as far as how the process, as we moved through this went, at first we would brainstorm these seating charts in Miro, and we would send that information into the dialogue matrix. The matrix would use that information for a given state to calculate, okay, we have these character adjacencies, Turgle's standing next to Moran in this state, so we need to write an ambient between them. We wanted to have one conversation for every character, for every substate. Okay, then we need 18 different conversations. And it would generate a blank template, which we would send back into Writer Duet. And this ensured that we weren't constantly cross-checking with the spreadsheet, but we knew we were going to hit our baseline targets if we just filled in all the blank events in the Writer Duet script. On the Writer Duet end of things, we would take these conversation ideas that we've been brainstorming in Miro and start to drill down into the actual language, do voice explorations, and then ultimately arrive at the dialogue events that we would use in the game, and we would send them into the database, where again we would tag them up and they'd be ready to go. Some of the information, though, would flow back the other way. So for instance, every time we made a push into the database and got all the content tagged up, it would update the dialogue matrix, which had a big metrics readout showing what we'd written versus what we said we were going to write. So there would be big red blocks all over the place if we hadn't written something that we had established and set out to do in our dialogue targets. Another reason this was valuable is because ultimately these dialogue targets weren't meant to be high water marks, what we want the final product to be. They were just meant to be baselines. And then ultimately, the goal was to empower the writers to, if they had a great idea for a certain conversation in a certain substate, the system would be capable of taking those facts and putting them into the game. But since the writing process was a little more diffuse like that, it was very useful to have a metrics tool where we could see, oh, we're kind of overwriting a lot in this substate, or shoot, this character doesn't have any conversation dialogue. We need to fix that. That's something that might be broken. We overlooked it. So that was just a very useful tool as we were steering the ship. And then finally, this allowed us to change our planning on the Miro end of things, and kind of that completes the cycle. Some of the decisions that arose from this process would be, we realized that one of our characters had no ambient dialogue in the entire game, and that made us realize, oh shoot, Tulok, our soothsayer, isn't actually standing next to anyone. She isn't standing close enough to anyone over the course of the game. So we were able to move some characters over to her in given substates so that they could have fun little interactions and we get to showcase some more of the character. So that's just an example of how the pipeline here really was a critical feedback tool. And of course, it must be said, there is no feedback quite like jumping into the engine and playing it on the sticks and seeing how it feels. And that was also a great tool that we used to shape the writing process. I'm going to hand it back to Cheyenne now, and she's going to take us through some of our inclusive storytelling approaches in the Cantina.
All right, so inclusive storytelling in DEI was always a fundamental premise and goal that we had for the Cantina. We felt that that was going to deliver the most robust Cantina experience. And we wanted to make sure that that was supported not only by our character concepts and our voice explorations, but also very intentional player interaction models. So you'll see a lineup of many of our underrepresented identities who display a range of different voices, visual representations, and each of them also have pretty distinct and specific player interaction models. Just a caveat, this talk isn't going to cover why DEI is so important or how to do it perfectly, but it was a big problem that we approached, And there's a lot of production hurdles and challenges in the pipeline in terms of scoping and getting the appropriate resources to authentically represent these identities. And so we wanted to flag some of those learnings for you so that you can infuse your own spaces with some inclusive storytelling and hopefully bring those learnings back to us in a future GDC talk. All right, we're going to first step through the standard character creation pipeline. For those of you who've been engaged in it for a while, this is probably pretty familiar. First, art and writing would collaborate and pitch a concept. Lots of back and forth. We're really just trying to explore voices and how that would best be represented visually. After we landed on a concept that we were really satisfied with, the writing room would then hone in on the voice and create some casting sides. These are some quintessential character scenes where we get to see who they really are and how they might perform. Once we get the auditions back, we'd have key stakeholders weigh in and choose their favorite performers. This usually involved more of directors and leads and people who are going to be very hands-on with that character. And then we'd hand it off for the rest of the in-game translation pipeline. Now, to contrast this, the DEI casting pipeline had a few more steps that we had to build into the process. The first one being we did a lot more preliminary DEI research. So this involves consulting internal ERGs, employee resource groups. This involved looking at internal DEI primers. It also involved polling our internal dev team to see if any individuals were willing to share any experience that was relevant or wanted to weigh in on this kind of representation. This is also the step where if we felt that we were really treading in unknown waters, we could bring in a cultural consultant. Then we'd go into the art and writing concepts phase. There's a few more rounds of back and forth, and we may have the key stakeholders start to weigh in even at this early stage. Then we would produce an enhanced casting side. So the writing room wanted to be a lot more clear on what this character's backstory was about, what their voice was like, and give at least 2 scenarios or 2 casting sides to make sure that we were getting a couple of different performances from each of the potential candidates who might eventually play this role. This led into potentially additional casting rounds. I think for most of our DEI characters, we had at least 2 rounds of casting. And that's more of an industry-wide problem. There's a pretty limited pool of underrepresented talent. And so make sure that you may have to build in some extra time to make sure that you're getting, casting a broad net and getting as many performers as possible. Then we would do an enhanced stakeholder weigh-in. So anybody who was called out during that preliminary research round, any internal devs who wanted to share their experience and weigh in gets to be a part of this step. And we have a slightly more diverse council who is evaluating our potential performers. Then we would do in-game translation as usual. And we built in one extra step where we would do additional review, where we'd set up internal Slack channels and get some more team feedback. All right, so that is how we landed on the concept and the initial explorations for these characters. But we also wanted to support their representation with very intentional design interactions. So we are going to walk through a couple of different characters who represent a fully inclusive story, Winnie and Zig on one side, and Ash, who is more of a light inclusive story. And what I mean by these terms is we had a fantastic race and sexuality expert come in and talk to Respawn internally and brought us these terms to describe how much of that character's identity is playing like a primary role and really being exposed to the player and how much that's actually driving their story. So we'll start with Winnie and Zig. Winnie and Zig represent a lovely, adorable queer romance. And the way that we approach this is we were faced with the problem of wanting to expose the player to their content, but not making the player feel like they were playing matchmaker and that they were controlling this romance and how it unfolded. So we employed a state-based inflection arc. So what that means is the player has the opportunity to recruit Winnie earlier on in the game in an earlier macro state, and then she'll come back to the cantina and their romance will start to unfold. But if the player doesn't recruit Winnie early, at a certain state, Winnie will find her way into the cantina, and their romance is still going to play out. So for players who are really invested in that kind of storyline, they get exposure to some earlier content, but regardless, these characters are still going to have this romance play out. On the other hand, Ash, we felt as a room was a character, even though they were non-binary, the main feature we wanted to focus on is their profession and their craft. They are the galactic producer, music person with their little DJ droid, and that's what we wanted to focus on. And so we employed a system-based arc. So if the player isn't interacting and not investing in this additional side content, they might not get a lot of their story. All right, so we're just going to recap on some of the takeaways for building in inclusive storytelling into your pipeline. You got to plan a lot of time. There's a lot of pre-work that goes into addressing potential biases, and there are going to be some hiccups along the way that you may not have expected, like having a limited casting pool and requesting extra rounds of casting and casting that broader net. Try to build in as many sources of feedback as possible, so ERGs, focus groups, in-house devs, and build those in early and often throughout the character creation pipeline. And then finally, explore a range of light to fully inclusive character storylines. If a character is only obsessed with this one aspect of their identity, even though it's quite critical, it could come off as sort of one note, and just try to experiment with a whole range of characters who have different conflicts on their mind and different involvements and want to show different facets of themselves to the player. And now I'm going to hand it back to Cole to wrap us up with some key Cantina takeaways.
Awesome. Thank you, Cheyenne. So yeah, I'm just going to speak a little bit to some of the main takeaways, especially on the design end of things, from how this sort of, the way that we approached and apportioned all of this content, how it all turned out from our perspective. So ultimately, we had talked about these sort of two poles between the engagement-based dialogue and the state-based dialogue. And at the end of the day, we ended up moving more towards the state-based end of things. So we filled in our macro states and sub-states with dialogue that reflected what Cal was doing throughout the story and that mapped onto Cal's tonal journey. And then later in the process, we went in and filled in a lot of the additional characters and worked to reward repeated engagement. So the majority of our content was state-specific, and because it's state-specific, if you'll recall that poor red line player who ignores the cantina for the entire game, that means we have hundreds of dialogue events that are very missable, including some critical ones for side characters. And telemetry indicated that 70% of our players continued completing side content after the story, and the majority of those for multiple hours. So we had a lot of players who did leave the cantina for the end, and that meant that a lot of the writing that we put into the state-based end of things wasn't as visible for them. So ultimately, the takeaway here is not just to write less generally. The takeaway would just be to keep your eye on the ball as far as how the player is going to experience the content, and try to, through playtesting and as much data as you can get, figure out where players are spending the most time, and then put a proportional amount of effort into building those areas out. Another aspect of the game was we wrote a ton of characters. 18 was a lot of characters to be just completely optional, but to have their own stories in the cantina. Ultimately, this landed well with a lot of people, and we've had instances of pretty much every one of those 18 players has someone who's online saying that's their favorite character, who's that character's #1 fan. So that reflected the success of our diversity goals and a lot of the inclusive storytelling approaches that we took, because that meant that a lot of people saw themselves reflected in the content, and people were able to find things to engage with across the spectrum of characters. That said, we ultimately kind of had to sacrifice some depth for breadth at this point, because with 18 characters, you definitely have to cover a lot of ground there. And if we had been a little bit sharper with our unique selling points for each of those characters, there were opportunities to maybe combine characters or cut characters that ultimately weren't adding something new to the roster, and then spend that extra scope to deepen the characters who are already there. So ultimately, I think while a lot of these characters landed really well, the goal in the future would be to continue refining the balancing act here. And I'll hand it back to Cheyenne.
Yeah, so we just wanted to wrap up with some credits. The Cantina was one of the features that we started digging into as a development team and collaborating from the earliest stages of the production on Jedi Survivor. And so we wanted to do some special call-outs for all of the folks and departments who poured their heart and soul into making this an interdisciplinary reality. So big thanks to all of the writing room, narrative and design teams were in step with us all along the way. Concept art drove so many of these like wacky initial ideas that the writing room just went wild with. Animation brought it all to life. Environment art, audio, music, tech design, code, everyone. UI, UX, lighting, QA, and of course our partners at Lucasfilm really helped us evaluate our characters and how we were adequately representing some of these DEI goals.
Thank you.
That's it.
It looks like we've got about 9 minutes for questions, if anyone has any.
Hi, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you for such an incredible game. I'm very curious, since your work involved so many different teams, like mission design with what side content you introduce, narrative, ambient tech design. Do you have any advice for collaborating with basically every single team on the game?
Yeah, so the question is, given that this is such an interdisciplinary effort, do we have any advice for cross-department collaboration? Do you want to start?
Sure, absolutely. And I think one of the things that Cheyenne mentioned was that so many of the great ideas for this idiosyncratic rogues gallery of characters came from different places on the team, and there were several pieces of concept art that everyone on the team just latched onto originally. It's like, okay, we have to write that and figure out who that is. I think probably the planning and dialogue targets end of the spectrum was where we tried to build in a lot of those supports for other departments. So trying to interface with design to figure out what are rumors exactly going to look like. This character needs to have 4 rumors to correspond with 4 pieces of side content they need to send you to. So we need to ensure that we've got room for all of that in their dialogue targets and that sort of thing. So this is probably a circular answer to the question, but just like the communication and kind of trying to front load as much of that as possible so that when it comes time to turn the crank on the content mill, you're going in the right direction and you're not leaving a bunch of grass unwatered.
And just to add to that, even though we dove into how the writing room would kind of pitch some of these concepts and start with some voice explorations, a lot of these character concepts originated with concept or someone else on the team who just had a wild pitch for a character. And so it just took a lot of willingness and a lot of conversation and communication between the writing team and whoever is pitching that concept to really realize that. I remember that our first batch of characters came from concept, like this one really wacky, amazing concept piece that included most of our alien characters, actually. And then we went and kind of looked at what some of our design goals were and narrative goals were, and then tried to match up some of these personalities and hone in on how they're going to be translated and experienced by the player.
Awesome. Thank you.
Time for one more?
Yeah.
Totally.
I guess this is a two-parter. Sorry. Did you have a sense of prioritized conversations? Like, could multiple conversations match a current substate? And if so, is there a priority you'd put them in? And then it's maybe related is, would one conversation be governed by one set of state, or did it branch inside the conversation? If that makes sense.
Yeah, so the question was, what did our concept of dialogue prioritization look like? And then within a conversation, how did the branching work, if that reflects it? Okay, awesome. On the prioritization end of things, every conversation in the game had a weight on it, and it was always pick the highest weighted conversation, and that was proportional to the number of facts that were attached to it. So if something was super, super specific, only going to be valid for one state, we'd better make sure that's top of the stack.
Totally. Yeah, we did the same thing on Firewatch.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Just curious. Cool.
Perfect. And there, we did have some light branching inside of given dialogues. So when you walked up to a character, it would pick for you you the most, the highest priority dialogue. But once you were inside the dialogue, there were some little choices that you could make to sort of just flavor your experience. And then there were a few cases where we would set a conditional tag on one of those, and then you'd get a conversation that called back to a choice you made. So you compliment someone on something here, and then later they say, thank you, actually, that meant a lot to me. Those were all pretty surface layer, and mostly just wanted to like get the player doing more than just like setting their controller down on the coffee table when a dialogue starts to play. Like they can engage with it. But we tried to keep the branching pretty light there to reflect just the linearity of Cal's story.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. Hi. Time for another one?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. This is awesome talk. Really appreciate it. I was wondering, your sort of like writer tech stack was really interesting. How much of that was like emergent, or how much of that was sort of predetermined, or like, how do you get writers on board for like what is ultimately a pretty technical process? Yeah, I would just love to hear a little bit more about that.
I didn't quite catch that if you want to
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like your flow chart regarding writing in, just sure. How did that sort of process emerge, or was it like established prior? It was just an interesting, concept. Love to hear more about it.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the question had to do with the flow chart of the different tools and how information flowed through, and then kind of how we onboarded the writers onto that process. I think it was definitely designed with, and this is kind of a thing people say a lot, but like designed with our specific writing team in mind. So like we have our writers, a lot of them have narrative design backgrounds and whatnot. So it was definitely they were ready to engage with some of the non-linearity of the system. But there were definitely like steps built in to try and really streamline things for the writers so that they could really just focus on homing in on the characters. So for instance, like the auto generation of the scripts, so that they're not having to sort of tab over and say, okay, I gotta go through a spreadsheet and count the number of things they have to write. It's just throw them in with some blank lines, Z blank line Cal blank line Z blank line. Cool, that's the scene, and then they go in and add all of the detail to it. But they're not having to think as much about some of the sort of the broad planning. At the same time, I don't want to make it seem like they were siloed to that, because a lot of I think they, especially as the process went on, did a really great job of looking for opportunities to enhance interactivity and to take advantage of some of those systems there. Hopefully that answered your question.
No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm curious what your favorite conversation or interaction is that required hyper-specific criteria that most players might have missed. What are some Easter eggy type of conversations that you want to highlight?
There was one where. Oh, sorry.
repeat the question.
Oh, yes. Sorry. The question was, did we have a favorite dialogue event that involved like super hyper-specific tagging that was sort of rare for a given instance? I do remember one where there's a state in which Turgle is enthusing about this seashell that he's found somewhere, and the order in which you encounter dialogues in the hub about that determine the things that people say. So, for instance, if you go to Monk first, and Monk says, "Listen, this guy Turgle is just railing on about this shell." If you go to Turgle, Turgle will start to tell you about the shell, and Cal will say, "Okay, I already heard about this. Please shut up." And so there are little kind of like funny gags built in. I think that was a highlight for me. If you have one.
Yeah, I think some of Moran's later conversations, once you've hit their inflection event, shows a very different side of them. So it requires a lot of player engagement, and it's a very subtle, inclusive storyline, if you will. And if you're not keyed into that storyline and you haven't been investing visits to him frequently, you might miss that. And so when you actually get to see the other side of Moran, it's a lot more soft and vulnerable, and a really good contrast to that frosty smuggler we see at the beginning. All right. I think we're right about at time. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
We're going to continue some Q&A across the hall.